He was ordered to hunt the enemy, but he ended up pointing his guns at his own side. The morning of March 16, 1968 began like so many others in Kwangangai province. Mist still clung to the paddies when Warrant Officer Hugh Thompson Jr. lifted his O-23 Raven observation helicopter off the runway at Lock-in. The little bubble cockpit aircraft, fragile as a dragonfly, unarmed except for the men who flew in it, climbed into a pale sky above the Vietnamese countryside. Thompson had flown dozens of missions like this. Scout the village. Mark enemy positions, report back. He was good at his job, methodical, careful. A man who believed in doing things the right way. Below him, the hamlet of Mỹ Lai lay quiet in the early light. No return fire. No fleeing fighters. No signs of the 48th Viet Cong Local Force Battalion that intelligence reports had promised would be there. What Thompson saw instead, as his helicopter banked low over the paddy fields and tree lines, would shatter something in him that could never be fully repaired. To understand what happened that morning, you have to understand what American soldiers had been enduring in Kwangangai for months. The province was a Viet Cong stronghold, and the soldiers of Charlie Company, 1st Battalion, 20th Infantry Regiment had paid a devastating price just moving through it. Booby traps, land mines, men coming home in pieces or not coming home at all. The enemy was invisible, the villages were suspect, and the frustration had curdled into something dark and collective. The operation targeting Mỹ Lai was called Task Force Barker. Its commanders believed the village harbored active Viet Cong combatants. Charlie Company, led by 24-year-old Lieutenant William Calley, was tasked with sweeping through the hamlet and destroying the enemy. The men were told to expect a fight. They were told to go in hard. Some accounts suggest they were told to leave nothing standing. The briefings the night before were, depending on who you ask, ambiguous at best and murderous at worst. What is not ambiguous is what happened when the helicopters carrying Charlie Company touched down in the fields outside Mỹ Lai on the morning of March 16th. There was no resistance. Not a single shot was fired at American troops as they entered the hamlet. What they found were villagers, mostly women, children, and old men, preparing their morning meals. The Viet Cong battalion was not there. What happened next defies easy language. Within minutes the killing began. Villagers were pulled from their homes and shot. Families were herded into groups and executed. The irrigation ditch on the eastern edge of the hamlet became a site of mass murder, bodies piling upon bodies as soldiers opened fire on crowds of unarmed civilians. Children, infants, elderly men who could barely stand. By the time it was over, somewhere between 347 and 504 civilians would be dead. The estimates vary. The reality does not. Hugh Thompson was watching from above. From the cockpit of his OH-23, he had already begun marking wounded civilians with green smoke so that following ground troops would know to help them. But the ground troops were not helping them. The smoke was marking them for death. Thompson would realize this only gradually, the horror assembling itself piece by piece through his cockpit glass. He saw a captain walk up to a wounded woman on the ground and kill her where she lay. He saw the ditch. He saw what was in it. His crew chief, Specialist Lawrence Colburn, and his door gunner, Specialist Glenn Andriotta, saw it too. No one spoke at first. There are moments when reality arrives faster than the mind can process it, when what you are witnessing is so far outside the bounds of anything imaginable that the brain simply stalls. Thompson later described the feeling as confusion that curdled into certainty. He knew what he was seeing. He knew it was wrong. And then, at some point that no military manual, no officer's training, no institutional guideline had ever prepared him for, he decided he was going to do something about it. Thompson set his helicopter down between a group of fleeing Vietnamese civilians and a group of advancing American soldiers. He stepped out onto Vietnamese soil and walked toward Lieutenant Calley's men. What he said in those moments varies slightly between accounts, but the substance is clear. He told his crew, told them directly and without ambiguity, that if the ground troops opened fire on the civilians they were sheltering, they were to open fire on the ground troops. American soldiers, pointing weapons at other American soldiers over the bodies of Vietnamese civilians, in a war that was already tearing the country apart. Thompson was not a particularly large man. He was not a legendary figure, not yet. He was a 25-year-old helicopter pilot from Stone Mountain, Georgia, son of a World War II veteran raised with a particular and unambiguous understanding of right and wrong. And in that moment, standing in a field in South Vietnam with the smell of cordite and death in the air, he simply refused. He refused to leave. He refused to look away. He got on his radio and called in other helicopters to evacuate the civilians still alive in the ditch. He personally climbed down into that ditch and alongside Andriotta pulled a child from beneath the bodies of the dead. They airlifted 11 civilians to safety that morning, 11 people who would not have survived without Hugh Thompson. When he returned to base, Thompson was trembling. He filed a report. He told his superiors what he had seen. He used words like murder. He was, by multiple accounts, emotional to the point of threatening to resign his commission. He told the people above him that a war crime had been committed, that American soldiers had massacred unarmed civilians, that somebody needed to answer for it. For a long time, nobody listened. The cover-up began almost immediately. Reports filed in the aftermath of My Lai described the operation as a military success. 128 enemy dead. A significant engagement. The massacre was buried under paperwork and silence, the truth smothered beneath bureaucratic language and institutional self-protection. It would be more than a year before investigative journalist Seymour Hersh broke the story publicly, in November of 1969. The photographs taken by Army photographer Ron Heberl, images so stark and terrible that some publications refused to run them, finally made the invisible real. America looked at what had been done in its name, in its uniform, and the country fractured a little more along fault lines that were already deep. Lieutenant William Calley was court-martialed. He was convicted of the premeditated murder of 22 civilians and sentenced to life in prison. He served 3.5 years under house arrest. Nixon commuted his sentence. He was paroled in 1974. He later managed a jewelry store in Georgia, gave occasional interviews, and expressed with some hesitation something that resembled remorse near the end of his public life. And Hugh Thompson was treated as a traitor. When he testified before military investigators, when he told the truth about what he had seen and what he had done, he was not praised. He was condemned. Anonymous callers threatened his life. Dead animals were left on his doorstep. Colleagues turned away from him in corridors. Members of Congress denounced him on the floor of the House of Representatives, not Calley, not the men who had carried out the massacre, but Thompson, the man who had tried to stop it. He was accused of being unpatriotic, of betraying his fellow soldiers, of aiding the enemy by speaking the truth. He struggled with it for years. There were nightmares. There was guilt, not the guilt of a man who had done wrong, but the particular and punishing guilt of a witness, of someone who saw and could not unsee, who saved 11 and could not save the hundreds he had watched die from above. He left the Army in 1983. He went home to Louisiana. He drove a truck. He tried to live quietly with something that would not stay quiet. It took 30 years. In 1998, Hugh Thompson Jr., Lawrence Colburn, and Glenn Andreatta were awarded the Soldier's Medal, the United States Army's highest decoration for non-combat valor. The ceremony was held at the Vietnam Veterans Memorial in Washington. Some who were there said Thompson wept. He had never stopped believing that what he did was simply what anyone should have done. The hardest thing, he said in later interviews, was not the standoff in the field. The hardest thing was coming home and being told that stopping a massacre made you the enemy. Glenn Andreatta had died in a helicopter crash in 1968, just weeks after My Lai, never knowing that history would remember him. Thompson and Colburn returned to Vietnam in 1998 to My Lai itself and met with survivors. Thompson embraced a woman he believed he had helped save. She thanked him. He apologized for what exactly he could not fully articulate, for all of it perhaps, for the world that had made it possible. Hugh Thompson Jr. died on January 6, 2006 in Pineville, Louisiana. He was 62 years old. He had spent the last years of his life speaking at military academies and universities, not as a hero recounting glory, but as a man trying to transmit something urgent and fragile across the gap between his experience and the young people sitting in front of him. He told them that following orders was not an excuse, that the law of war exists for a reason, that there is a line, and that when you see it being crossed, you have an obligation not to your unit, not to your rank, not to the political machinery of the war you find yourself in, but to your conscience and to the human beings in front of you. Moral courage, he understood, is not the absence of fear. It is the decision to act correctly in spite of consequences you can already see coming. Thompson could see them. He knew what it would cost him. He landed his helicopter anyway. The hamlet of My Lai has a museum now. It is a quiet place surrounded by gardens. The ditch is still there, marked with a small monument. Each year on March 16th, survivors and their descendants gather there to remember. The youngest victims were infants. The oldest were grandparents who had survived decades of war only to die in the fields of their own village at the hands of soldiers who were supposed to represent something better. Hugh Thompson believed in that something better. He believed in it stubbornly, at great personal cost, in the middle of one of the worst days of the entire Vietnam War. And because one man in a bubble cockpit helicopter decided that what was happening below him was not something he could simply report and fly away from, 11 people drew breath that they would not otherwise have drawn. Lived lives. had children, grew old. History does not always reward the ones who do what is right. Sometimes it takes decades. Sometimes the medal comes late and the wounds it tries to address never fully close. But the record exists. The names are known. And in the long, unfinished reckoning with what America did in Vietnam, the story of Hugh Thompson Jr. stands as proof that even in the worst circumstances human beings can imagine, the choice remains. It is always there, the choice to land. The choice to stand between the killers and the killed. The choice to point your weapon at the thing that is wrong, regardless of whose uniform it wears. He was ordered to hunt the enemy. He found something else entirely, and he chose, at the cost of almost everything, to be the right kind of man.